Hi, welcome to the third and final session in our series of Untangling the Challenges of Aging, Vital Decisions. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Karen Lewis with Willamette Valley Hospice and Palliative Care and the moderator of today's session. Today we're going to discuss the Oregon POLST form, and we've invited Dr. Margaret Manoogian from Western Oregon University to share with us how to have conversations with our families about our wishes as we age. But first, I want to extend a special thank you to our sponsors for making this series possible for all of us. Our title sponsor is Collier Law, and our corporate sponsors are Salem Health, Oregon Oncology, Coldwell Banker Commercial Mountain West Real Estate, and Norco Medical. Our webinar series is free for all of the sessions, which includes today. If you'd like to see these sessions in their entirety, just head over to our YouTube channel, www.youtube.com/Willamette Valley Hospice, to view them all. Today's session will be uploaded in a couple of days. If you wish to give a donation to WVH, feel free to visit us at our website, which is www.wvh.org. Any donations will go to community bereavement programs unless otherwise noted. And while you're there, check out our calendar for more information on all our programs and upcoming events. You will receive a recording of today's session in the next few days, along with a survey. I strongly encourage you to fill out that survey and send it back to us. Your feedback is so important, and the information you give us informs future topics and what you would like us to cover in the future. Questions are going to be answered at the end of the presentation, and any that do not get answered due to time restraints will be addressed via email to you. Enter your questions in the chat box on the right-hand side of your screen. We have lots of information to cover today, so if we don't have time to get to your question, please email us your question so that we can be sure to address it. To start, I'll be sharing information on the Oregon POLST, and then I'll be introducing Dr. Margaret Manoogian to share her presentation on making your wishes known to family. So let's get started. As we mature and either develop an advanced or life-limiting illness or medical frailty, many of us hear the term POLST and wonder what that is. The word POLST itself is an acronym, and it stands for Portable Orders of Life-Sustaining Treatment. It is a medical order that informs emergency medical personnel outside of the hospital what your wishes are concerning your decision about resuscitation and CPR in the event of a medical crisis. More states across the country are starting to implement and use POLSTs this way. But if you live in Oregon and you have an advanced illness or medical frailty, you and your doctor may decide that having a POLST is what's right for you. Let me explain. In our country, at times, we have overemphasized the use of CPR. If you are having a medical crisis and you are not able to speak or advocate for yourself, emergency medical professionals make the presumption that you want CPR. There's no opportunity in that moment for you to choose whether the efforts should be made to save your life if you're unconscious. The POLST form allows you to make those wishes known, even if you're unable to advocate or communicate in the moment. The POLST form is available through your doctor's office or the Oregon POLST website. Once completed, the POLST is signed by your doctor. It is a medical order. Your doctor then sends the form to the Oregon POLST registry, where it is logged and goes into a database. This database is accessible 24/7 by emergency medical personnel. In the event of a medical crisis in your home or elsewhere, EMTs will arrive when someone calls 911. Once on the scene, these emergency medical technicians will assess your condition and will call the Oregon POLST registry to determine your wishes quickly. This will allow them to provide efficient medical care and more comfort for your family when you are very near to the end of your life. when you are not breathing and you do not have a heartbeat. I'm going to take a moment to upload this form so you can see it right now. There we go. Okay, you should be seeing the Oregon POLST form on your screen right now. It is outlined in pink. In filling this form out with your doctor, the two of you are going to discuss your wishes and what kind of medical interventions you would like to see as you face a medical crisis. The first part is very simple. It's in section A, and it describes whether you would like the EMTs to attempt resuscitation or not. Attempting resuscitation means all efforts of CPR and chest compressions are used to save your life. By choosing the do not attempt resuscitation or the DNR option, that means emergency personnel will not attempt resuscitation, but will make sure you are comfortable and not in pain and provide comfort for your family at the time of this crisis. Part 2 of the form, or I should say Part B, actually talks about medical interventions and treatment and the treatment plan you would like. You can choose anything from comfort care, limited treatment, or full treatment. Your doctor should explain the differences of these three options. The POLST form, as opposed to the advance directive, is a medical order signed by your doctor and sent to the POLST registry. And they sign back here on the back. The advance directive you learned about from Melissa and Ryan is a legal document. Let me unshare my screen. Melissa and Ryan gave a very nice example last week about the differences between these two forms and when and in what circumstances the POLST and advance directives should be used. If you have more questions about the differences of these two forms, I encourage you to go back and look at that video. It's posted on our YouTube channel. But to summarize, the POLST is an emergency medical order used outside of the hospital in an emergency. An advance directive is a legal document used inside the hospital after the initial urgency of your medical crisis has passed. But the POLST form is not the only way to make your wishes known. We've invited Dr. Margaret Manoogian to join us today to share the importance of having these serious conversations with your family around your wishes. Dr. Manoogian is a very popular speaker with us and currently serves as the head of gerontology at Western Oregon University. She teaches courses on social ties and aging, end-of-life issues, as well as cognitive, physical, and developmental changes in aging. As a family gerontologist, she investigates intergenerational transmissions among older parents and adult children. Her special interest, though, is in facilitating community education on topics that are of importance to older adults and their families, like this, which makes her talk today right in her wheelhouse. Dr. Manoogian, thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Let's see. And let's see if is my PowerPoint in front of you, everyone? Are you able to see that?
Yes.
All right. See the whole screen. Okay. So I want to welcome all of you. I'm Margaret, and I'm happy to be here. I love my community partnership with Willamette Valley Hospice. Before I start, I wanted to just tell you a little bit about myself, just to give you some context. My academic research, like what was just described, is I've really focused a lot of my efforts on the conversations, stories, and legacies that get transmitted across generations. And I'm particularly interested in the relationship between adult children and their parents. So from a more of a evidence-based scientific kind of exploration, I've looked at the intergenerational transmissions through the family stories and families that have experienced genocide, which is my family cultural history on my father's side. I'm Armenian. I've also looked at and talked with numerous families, both on the West Coast and also in Appalachia, about when a member has type 2 diabetes and how younger family members, adult children, for instance, support the older parent in that. And I've also spent a lot of time looking at how adult children and their older parents negotiate care, negotiate needs across life course transitions like retirement, caregiving, when a child graduates or enters into college, and so those types of things. So I have a real strong academic interest in this, but I always like to share the story when I talk about this personal story, because I have a personal investment in this as well. This is my father and my mother. Both now are no longer living. They both have died. My father died in 1998, and he was a quiet man. He was someone who never really clearly talked about his needs, about what he wanted with end of life. And I was in my late 20s, early 30s when my father was ill. He had Parkinson's with dementia. And when it came to end of life for him, as he was transitioned into a care community because of, in waiting for actually a veterans hospice home, this was in the Bay Area, we were navigating without really understanding what he wanted. And so we were kind of struggling in terms of where would he most like to be? What kinds of, how would he like his body to be treated after he died? Who would he like present? Would he want a memorial service? We knew none of that. And we learned a lot from that. When my mother 10 years later died, we at that point had collaboratively talked about advanced directives. We had the POLST front and showing by the front door in case of when paramedics might arrive, and had that signed by her doctor. She was very clear about that she wanted to be cremated. She wanted her ashes to be spread in the high Sierras. She wanted my sister and I to backpack her ashes up there, in part because with her congestive heart failure, she couldn't experience high altitudes, and that was a loss for her. We had lots of conversations, multitudes of conversations, and things weren't always the same. Sometimes a new idea would emerge, and we learned a lot from that. And that's probably my personal commitment as to why I want to do this. So what did I learn about, what have I learned both from an academic perspective and also from my personal family experiences? Well, clearly we all die, and how we die is unknown to us. I would not have predicted my parents' end-of-life experiences. We had no idea what that would look like. But knowing the wishes of our family members or not can shape every aspect of that experience for end of life. Not knowing my father's needs and wishes, knowing my mother's needs and wishes. In fact, knowing my mother's needs and wishes was an absolute gift to myself and also to my sister. Families and support communities consist of a lot of individual members, and they may have differing ideas, values, and sensitivities. So it can be rather challenging to think about this from a family perspective, because every person might have different ideas and needs, and I'll talk more about that here in a minute. And not everyone will want the same path to end of life, and not everyone will have the same resources available. And so that's going to obviously influence these conversations and the experiences that you might want for your own end of life. Navigating some of these issues when you've not talked about this and there's immediate needs present can be really difficult, and I can speak from experience on that. At those moments, we are typically at our most vulnerable, and without any kind of planning, it can be very, very stressful, on top of just the issues that you're going through in terms of your own grief and anticipated loss. COVID-19, I think right now has really underscored this vulnerability, as family members in these cases have not been able to maybe act out the way they want that end of life experience to look like because of restrictions in hospitals and other clinical settings. So let me give you some context as to how things have changed over time. We're seeing many changes in how people die and what that end of life experience looks like, and what importance individuals put on these types of end of life wishes. This is a graph. You don't need to study it very clearly, but this is this is looking at 1900, the year 1900, how people died in 1900 versus how they died in 2010. And you can see that large green category at the top in 1910. That was infectious diseases. That was primarily how people died. They died at much younger ages in general. We have a much longer lifespan now. And you can see as you transitioned into 2010, we have many more individuals dying of heart disease and cancer, which were true in 1900. But look at the top. We also see Alzheimer's and we see diabetes, and those are chronic conditions. And what we're seeing over time is that we are dying, we're living longer and more likely to have chronic conditions, or what we call comorbidity, maybe having two of those going on at the same time. Also, the duration of death has changed. So when you have those infectious diseases, typically the duration to death was a lot shorter. And so when we look at trajectories, we talk about how long the end of life experience is, the onset of dying to the arrival of death. And we also look at the shape, like what's the course of that dying process? You know, what will the death be expected or unexpected? And let me give you a graph to kind of help you, and hang in there with me because I think this is all really important information. I'll get to some family specific stuff here in a second. I just wanted to show this to you so you could see that earlier we were most likely, our end of life was most likely to be communicable diseases. And if you look at this trajectory, you can see that we have the onset of the disease. There's either immediate death, there's a slow decline, or we may get better. But if you look to the right with more of these chronic, more degenerative diseases, you can see a trajectory that looks much more bumpy and up and down, where there's a longer dying process. It's slower, there might be ambiguous decline and unpredictable times of death. And that's what you see more likely with chronic illness and degenerative diseases. And so these trajectories are important to think about because in 1900, we may not have had a lot of older family members that we needed to provide care for and that typically did happen in the home. And family was preparing for death rituals. But in the late 20th and early 21st century, we tended to transition these deaths because of the increase in medical interventions and also the longer duration of these illnesses and declines. We see more of institutional deaths that have happened, where professionals are playing real critical roles in caring for the dying and organizing some of those post-death rituals. So what I want to point out here is that we're seeing a shift from more family-focused experiences to more institutional kinds of experiences. Okay, so keep that in mind. And part of that has been shaped by this trajectory that I just shared with you. Part of that's been shaped by our increase in medical expertise and interventions. And part of that has been the nature of what families take on in the context of their homes. Okay, but here's the deal. This is a study that I like to highlight. It was out of Stanford School of Medicine. Approximately 80% of Americans in this large nationally represented study said they prefer a home death. But the reality is that 60% die in acute care hospitals, 20% in nursing homes or some kind of long-term care like memory care communities, and 20% at home. So there's a disconnect here between what people want and what actually happens. So individuals typically use hospice care just in the last few weeks of their experience of end of life. Like they're called in late usually. And not every, and that's great that we have this option, but it's underused, especially when people prefer to be at home. Not every individual wants the same location for death. I just learned of a gentleman that was in a hospice house in Lynn County, in Albany specifically, and he preferred that setting, but he was able to die outside on the terrace in a garden in the sunlight, which was his choice of location. So, but the bottom line is that many die in places they don't prefer. And that's where conversations are critical. So why does this matter? Well, we're spending more time together. It's likely that older adults will not only grandparent if they have that opportunity, but they might be great-grandparents. We have more opportunities to participate in the end-of-life care of others. My parents actually died quite young. Most of my friends, I'm in my early 60s, are right now in the process of providing care and support for their parents, for the ones that need it. Not all of them do. Those we love may experience longer lives, but with chronic conditions like I mentioned, so that's going to be a challenge. We may have fewer people available to us as family caregivers. Some of you who like to listen to the news may have heard just recently that the new census data suggests that our population growth is not as what it was, and it's declining, like similar to the 1930s. So that means that we might not have younger people in our lives that can provide the informal support for caregiving that we may have had for the boomers, for instance. Potentially, we may have the gift as well as the urgency to plan. What I mean by that is that we might have, because of this different trajectory, we might have more time, actually, if we take advantage of it, to talk with our family members about end-of-life concerns and planning. And we may not have the end of life we prefer without the conversations. So it's really important, I believe, that we talk not only with our healthcare practitioners, but also with our family members and those we love. So that might include friends and other people within your networks. So why are we reticent to talk about death? Well, I think you probably all know the answer to this, but intellectually we may acknowledge our own mortality, but deep down we deny it. And I think it's something that definitely influences our planning. These conversations don't happen because we're anxious about death, what's called death anxiety. And you can see this around us. There is this societal push to avoid some of these conversations. We have an emphasis oftentimes in our society to focus on youth, to not focus on things that might be depressing or hard to talk about. And we even use euphemisms to even talk about death. We don't say died, we might say went somewhere else, or the eternal long-term sleep, or however we might use a euphemism to not even talk directly about using the words around death. It's just another indicator. And the research is mixed. When they look at men and women tend to have a little bit higher death anxiety than what men report. We know that some research has suggested that those with very strong religious convictions may have lower death anxiety than those that maybe still are religious or have a spiritual framework, or those that don't may have increased anxiety. We also have some research out there, but it's mixed. Some have shown this, some haven't, that if you haven't met some of your markers, your life accomplishments, or if you have past or future regrets, or potential regrets, that may also increase death anxiety. And developmental readiness for these conversations, it's been interesting anecdotally as I've talked to a lot of older adults about this. A lot of them tell me, excuse me, that they want to talk to their adult children about some of this, but their adult children are refusing to talk to them about it, or they don't want to go there. They'll say things like, "Oh, Mom, let's not talk about that now. I can't even think about that right now," or "That's too depressing to talk about," or "Why would you want to talk about? That's a long ways off." So I've seen some resistance, and usually it's fueled by death anxiety, anxiousness about these conversations. So from a developmental perspective, and that is something that I really try to think about, because when I study parent-child relationships across the life course, you have to think about how we all move down our own life course, and we do that linked with the people that we care about that are part of our family circle. So as I'm getting older, so are my children. And as they go through transitions of their own, I'm going through my transitions, but we're linked together as we together go through those transitions, if that makes sense. So older adults, what they have found is that they may express less death anxiety when compared to younger adults. Sometimes that's because the reality is our risk for dying goes up as we age, right? Another thing that older adults report is that they have friends, their social networks. They see more death because of who they are than the longer times that they've lived. Their focus tends to be more likely when expressed is not on death itself, but on the pain and burden. So will the end of life be painful for me? And will I be a burden, and I don't want to be a burden, on others? And those are two really common concerns for older adults. They've lived their life, they've increased their experiences with death, they are focused on pain management, how I'm going to deal with pain, how am I going to be able to end my life without being a burden to others. Younger adults, those that are more midlife, so I'm not talking about young adults, but midlife adults tend to have some of the highest levels of death anxiety. And in part because they are maintaining a lot of roles. And I kind of get this. For a lot of my middle-age period, I was a single parent. And my chant almost every night was, please just let me get my children to adulthood before I die. That was so important to me, that they could be prepared to be, you know, citizens and adults, and being able to maintain their own process and have agency to create their own pathways. So having all these different roles, work roles, parenting roles, most 90% or more people will end up being a parent. So that's a reality for a lot of people. Managing all of this, caregiving for potentially parents, all these roles makes individuals, adults at this age, more anxious about death, because they see that they have so many things they need to do and they have responsibility for doing those. You may know this already just from your own experiences as an adolescent and emerging adult, but you know, there's still this kind of framework around invincibility, and there's lots of risk taking within this particular age groups, and they're not at all thinking about end of life. They're thinking about starting their adult lives, and there's endless possibilities. So there's different concerns coming developmentally from all of these different folks. And what that means in particular for the parent-child relationship, which is the one that I focus on in my own work, is that there has to be this negotiation and renegotiation as we move through our different developmental transitions. And the way that a parent may have included or not included a child in a conversation gets renegotiated as those children become adults, as they move into adulthood, maybe as you become a grandparent, maybe you have a partner, maybe you don't have a partner, that will have implications for this. So there's a lot of developmental things to consider. Death anxiety and kind of where we are in our own life course will shape our willingness to have these discussions. So you probably get already that I'm very much supportive of having these conversations. And it doesn't need to be the one conversation. And in fact, it shouldn't be. It should be opening up the door, however wide, to start talking about some of these things. And so how do we start in these conversations? I like to just suggest some open-ended, some planning. You might invite people to your home, especially now that we're starting to see people able to gather in homes. So how do you want to structure this type of conversation? You might say something to your family members. I'd really like to talk to you about the type of care I want as I get older. Would you be willing to join me in that kind of conversation? And think about things like, what do I ask? So if you're an adult child and you want to talk to your parent about this, what do I ask? Well, it's important to ask open-ended questions. Make no assumptions. And I say that because I send a lot of my students, in fact, I'm doing that now, where they interview their older family members, and sometimes they find out things that are surprising and that they never knew about their older family member. And in part, it's because they were never asked. So it's important to ask open-ended questions, such as, tell me about what you envision for your aging process. How would you like to be supported when you may need some help? You know, what would be important to you? I had this conversation with one of my closest friends who was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. And early on, I said to her, and she's actually very slowly moving through this, so she's still very much present, but I said to her early on, I said, as one of your closest friends, how do you want me to support you? And one of the things she said to me was, I want you to talk to me directly. Please don't talk around me. Even if I don't remember the conversation later, talk to me. Eye contact. Use my name. Include me in the conversations. And I've been very loyal to that because she was very clear about what she wanted. So, ask yourself as you're setting up a conversation time, what will be important for me to share? Who do I want there? Where will we talk? This is a really important answer because you're going to want to have it. I've had some families try to do this in a restaurant, too noisy. You want to pick a place where everyone can access and hear. I don't hear well anymore in restaurants. I need to have a quiet location. I want it to be confidential. I want it to be a place where I'm not going to have people moving back and forth through that. Think about a time when you want to start these conversations. Maybe it's a meal time. You want to make sure that people are alert and it's a time that works for, it's not too early, but it's also not too late, because I have found sometimes that these conversations, when they're started, can last for quite a long time. And that's actually good. You can always say, let's do the next chapter tomorrow or next week, or maybe we should have a regular time that we have these conversations together. There are lots of resources out there that will help you introduce the topics, and some of these are probably already familiar with. There are discussion guides, like Consider the Conversation. There are TED Talks, like I've got a little photo below that you could watch a TED Talk together and then discuss it. There are films and books. The Atul Gawande book that some of you probably have read I still ask my students to read this. It's excellent. Being Mortal will start getting you thinking about some of these issues around aging and end of life. Badger's Parting Gift is a picture book that I use with children about talking about death and dying. And that can be a way to help parents get support and think about how they might want to talk with children about some of these things. Having advanced directive workshops. People laugh at me, but I called my children together and my ex-husband, and I said, I want all of you to come over for dinner, and we're all going to look at advanced directives together. We're going to do an advanced directive workshop. And it was interesting because watching my adult children, they were in their early 20s when I did this, and they looked at each other and they chose each other. And it was interesting as the person they wanted to be the spokesperson for them if they were unable to communicate for themselves. And as we worked through the workbook around the advanced directive, they started thinking about those scenarios. I think my ex-husband was a little hurt that they didn't choose him, but I totally got why they didn't want either of us. They wanted each other because they saw strengths in each other, and they figured the other would be around longer to be able to do these types of interventions or support through the process. Attend workshops and presentations. This is recorded. You can use this if you wanted to. You could download any of the YouTube videos as part of the seminar series and use those as conversation starters with other family members or friends or neighbors that weren't able to attend. And then estate planning is also an avenue for talking about some of these things. I will add that Ingrid Kanitas, who is a wonderful researcher in family ties and aging, found that there are two issues that older family members have. And one is when they think about end of life, besides burden and pain, which comes out of the health literature, regarding estate planning, a lot of older adults are very concerned about how they equitably can talk about estate planning with their children, their adult children and their other family members. But a second concern is wanting all of their family members to get along. Now, that's a pretty tall order, and it's not anything you're going to have control over once you've died, right? My mother tried. She put us both, my sister and I, as co-executors on her estate. And I looked at her, and my sister and I got along fine, but I looked at her and I shook my finger at her and I said, "You're doing that because you want to make sure that Linda and I are still talking with each other once you're no longer here." And she kind of nodded and said, "Yep." So, there is this concern, and it doesn't always happen the way we want. But these conversations can be a way to bring family together and talk about these things. And here are some specific questions that I found that have been really helpful. And there's lots out there. You can come up with your own discussion guide, which is actually something I do with students. I have them actually do these discussions as part of taking my Death, Dying, and Grief class. They have to choose who they want to do it with. Some do it with family, some do it with roommates. I had one student do it with her neighbors. They all gathered in a neighbor's house. This, of course, was pre-COVID. And so it's interesting to see who they decided to talk with. Best friends. But here are some questions that seem to work. If you learned that you had an illness that would limit your life, how would you like to spend the rest of your time? So what you're getting at there is quality of life. Not so much focused on quantity. How many years do you want? But it's what do you want the last of your years to look like? What types of treatments would you want? What types of treatments wouldn't you want? And that's where the advanced directive that you heard about earlier can be a really helpful document to help you think about some of those things and what kinds of treatments would be available, like what was mentioned about the POLST and CPR. Do you have someone in mind who you'd like to make health decisions if you were unable to do so? And here's a tricky one, because if you're going to choose an adult child, how do you make that happen with making everyone feel included, not just favoring or putting that responsibility on the one adult child? So you're going to want to think that through. Have you made other plans regarding end-of-life concerns? Sometimes we had an older adult who died, and his granddaughter was sharing with me that when they got to the house, everyone then descended on the house, and at the house they found Costco soda stacked up in the garage. They had instructions for the type of party he wanted them to do. He had everything out and laid out exactly what the planning he'd made. So when the family all got together, they had nothing to do but hang out with each other. That was a real gift, but it also might have been nice if they'd known about that, because they were stressing out before they got there. So the after effect was quite lovely. But in terms of sharing those things, I think it helps reduce the stress and helps give individuals a game plan, even if things happen that are unpredictable, which I guarantee there will be some unpredictable parts of end-of-life kinds of experiences. How would you like your choices to be honored at the end of life? My mother's best friend was on dialysis every day, and she decided she couldn't do it anymore. She stopped going to dialysis. She died within 2 weeks of stopping her treatment. And one of the things that was interesting about that is she wanted to have the memorial service at her church, but she said, I do not want this woman singing. I've never liked her singing. So if the choir is going to be there, please don't let her do the singing. And I would like this. She had exactly the scripture she wanted read. She knew exactly what kind of music she wanted. She definitely had ideas, and that made it really easy for her family to prepare for that memorial service. How important is it for you to be at home? Do you want others around you? Do you want to be by yourself? Believe it or not, there are people who choose that they want to be alone. They may not want to have lots of people around them. And then, what can I do, as an adult child, for instance, coming to an older parent, what can I do to best support you in your choices? As a spouse saying to a partner, what can I do to best support you in your choices? As an older parent saying to an adult child, what can I do to support you in your choices? So these are important questions that I found that have been really helpful. So what to remember, because I do want to I think this is my last slide. I can't remember. I get in a roll and I think, where am I? To remember, these conversations are an act of love, and they're an act of respect. And they show that you really want to know, and they show that you love the person enough to really want to do what they want and to honor them in this process. You need to know that this process also people may need reassurance. And I'll give you a quick personal example. My mother was, at the time I didn't know this, but she was 2.5 months out of her death. She was using a walker. My mother died of a combination of cancer and congestive heart failure. And we were in her home. I was with her for the summer. That's one of the advantages of being a teacher. I lived in Ohio. She was in the San Francisco Bay Area, so it was really a wonderful time to be with her. And I was behind her. We're going down the hallway, and she was with her walker, and she kept stopping her walker and saying out loud, I just don't know how this is going to work. And then she'd walk another step and she'd say, I don't know how this is going to work. And then she'd stop and she wouldn't say anything, but I knew she was thinking about the same thing. And I finally walked in front of her. I said, Mom, hold on a minute. And I looked at her and I said, are you worried about what is going to happen to you as you get closer to your end of life? And she kind of looked at me and nodded, and I said, listen, I will do everything I can to make sure that this is the type of end of life that you would want. And I pledge to you that Linda and I will talk to you about these things, and you will be a part of this process. And you could see her visibly relax. This was obviously something she was thinking about. But you may need reassurance. You may need patience. People may not want to talk a lot about these things initially, but you may have opened the door and there may be more opportunities. Be patient with that. And there could be potential resistance. And like I said, I see that more amongst the adult children than I do see that amongst the older parents. Communication, being open, available, assuring your loved ones that this is confidential, that you won't share any of this with anyone unless they choose to share it, unless you have permission to share it. And acceptance, because sometimes what they want is not at all what you want. And one of the biggest complaints I get from older parents is, please don't take away my autonomy. I want my decision. I want to still be part of the decision-making process, just like my friend who had Alzheimer's. Be aware of the pacing. Give lots of times for silent. When you ask an open-ended question of this depth, you have to let people take the time to answer. So, and frankly, as we get older, our retrieval time cognitively takes longer. So we don't respond. I don't respond as quickly as I did when I was 40 to things. It takes me longer to remember a name. It takes me longer to bring the content up through my file system to be able to express it to you. So I often tell my younger students when they're having these types of conversations, ask the question, then in your head, say 1, 1,000, 2, 1,000, and do that all the way till 10 at least, to give that person, particularly an older person, the opportunity to really think through something. And I've had these conversations in families where the family member has supplied a couple of questions ahead of time for people to think about so that they're prepared when they come. That could be a strategy that works well or not for your family situation. Be aware of power too. You know, I think there's this renegotiation of the adult-child, older-parent relationship sometimes is about power and who has authority and I should jump in and make these decisions. No, I should. And so just be, aware of that and think about that as you're talking. And remember that these conversations are conversations for a reason. You want to have more than one. You want to have opportunity to revisit things, and you want to be as inclusive of generations as possible. So it's okay to include your partner, but your adult children, your grandchildren, maybe a person in your life that's very important to you, like a good friend, a sibling, of your own from your family of origin might be important to include. And then remember too, to always ask for clarification. So if you don't really understand, feel free to clarify. Don't be afraid to ask questions. I'm not sure what you mean by that, or where would I find that? Or what are you thinking about this? It's not clear to me. And then the commitment part, which is what I suggested with my situation with my mom, in terms of my commitment to you is that my sister and I will communicate, we'll do everything possible to ensure and to help you in this path, whatever it will include. And inclusivity is really important. I was thrilled the first time I gave a talk similar to this in 2016 that we had a gentleman with his wife who attended. He had cancer, and when they got home, he immediately wanted to have a conversation with his adult children. And later, after he died, the wife shared with actually the staff at Willamette Valley Hospice, and I learned also this, that she really felt that this death was a good death. And death is never, obviously death includes a lot of grief and a lot of loss. But if you can have an end-of-life experience that doesn't include guilt, and doesn't include strife and tension because you don't know what was needed or what was wanted. That can be so important. So including people in this conversation, think broadly about who you might want to include and be inclusive. I've seen occasions and I've talked to folks who work in hospice and social workers and other palliative care and other contexts. The family members don't always get along, right, before the death. And you have to think about that after the death too for yourselves. You can't control it, but by including people, it means that everybody's on the same page. And I think that's a really important thing to include for families. So in closing, keep this in mind. More than 90%, this is out of the National Survey by the Conversation Project. It was a while ago, but I think this is probably still holds true. More than 90% feel it's important to talk about their wishes for end of life with others. Less than 30% have discussed what they want. So I'm encouraging all of you to not only, if you feel it's important to talk about this, and I'm assuming you might because you attended this session, be part of that percentage that not only thinks it's important, but also chooses to discuss it. So that is all that I have for my talk. And if I can get back to my screen here so I can stop sharing. There we go. I think I've stopped. Have I stopped?
You have, yes.
All right.
Thank you so much, Dr. Margaret. We really appreciate you. And I just want to give folks the chance to pop some questions in the chat box if they do. But while they're doing that, I have a question of my own I want to pitch to you and just get your feedback on.
Sure.
And it's kind of a personal question. It's actually our family, my mother-in-law, and she lives in another state. And there is a child, a sibling of my husband. And we want to be as supportive as possible to that sibling. But we live, a whole state away, as do 3 other siblings. What do you suggest for a family like that who are trying to be supportive of a sibling who's doing like the lion's share of the care for the older parent?
Yeah, it's a pretty common question. You also, it's great that you all want to help. There are situations where a sibling takes on that care and the other siblings don't want to bother. And so I've seen that happen as well. But with the other siblings that are far away wanting to help, that was my situation. My sister was 5 minutes close to my mom and I was 2,000 miles away. So one of the things that I tried to do was I knew that I needed to support the caregiver, which was my sister. So I asked her specifically what would be some of the ways I could support her. And part of that was providing respite. So when I would fly in, I said to her, I don't expect to see you or very little. You take this time for yourself. So I've seen sibling groups that have staged that and used different times to just give that sibling a break and saying, don't do anything here. We'll follow your instructions if you feel like there's instructions we need to follow, but please take this time for yourself. Then I also, one of the other things is, what are the things that you can do from afar? You might be able to handle some things that could happen from afar. I was dubbed the emotional support for my mom. I called her every evening. And it was a 3-hour difference. And so I would call her and it would last maybe 2 minutes or it could last 30 minutes. And I knew that she probably was watching the news in her recliner because she had neuropathy in her feet. And I knew she's probably watching the news. I was too busy as a single parent and working as an academic. And I'd say to her, tell me what's going on in the world today. Let's talk about that. And so it would give us a kind of a non-personal way to start. And she'd give her my little report. And then I would just be able to hear how she's doing. One time, actually, I by her voice and her breathing patterns, I actually was able to diagnose informally a stroke going on with my mom. Wow. I called my sister, I called the neighbor, and the neighbor ran down the street, immediately said, this is what I'm seeing. I said, call 911. And I kept calling my sister to get a hold of her to know. So sometimes you're not going to, it was, and it indeed was a stroke. So I was so used to her breathing and talking, I could tell when she was confused or whatever. So organizing finances could be another option. You know, whatever it is that, and usually too, that parent wants contact from you. So a commitment to phone conversations, grandchildren pen pal projects. I've done a couple of studies on the death of grandparents, and emerging adult grandchildren say one of their biggest regrets is guilt that they didn't spend enough time with their grandparents because of their own life, you know, busyness. So giving them some opportunity also, your own children or your siblings' children, to give them, not a lot, but some opportunities to interface with that older parent can be really helpful. And that also helps relieve some of the pressure for the sibling, because it shows the parent that other people are connected. And then finally, there are some ways to do that through technology. I've seen the use of aura frames, you know, where the older adult doesn't have to do anything. It's a frame, and you send pictures from your app there, and then when you call, I do this with my older aunt who's 91, she's in LA, and I pull up a picture, and then when I call her, I said, look at this picture, I want to show you what your great nephew looks like and what he's up to. And or I'll say, look, this is how this is progressing. Can you see my garden? Can you see the radishes? You know, so sometimes doing some of the technology that doesn't put all of that responsibility on the adult to learn it can be really helpful. And that then would give your the sibling, a chance to sit in another room, to attend, make phone calls, look at their email and such while you're engaging in that kind of interactive conversation. So I don't know if any of that's helpful, but that's...
Yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you. Thanks so much. Well,
Yeah.
We don't have any other questions in the chat box. What I'm going to say is, again, if people have questions after today's presentation, please email your question to info@wvh.org, and we will answer those in response to you. So, Dr. Manoogian, I just want to thank you so much for being with us today. And
Sure.
I just hope everybody who saw this got some lessons, and really kind of it piqued their interest into thinking what kinds of things they need to ask as, you know, as their parent or their loved one is approaching, you know, end of life or this new stage. I know I have to go have a conversation with my husband now, so, you know, well, you know,
that's good. And I'll add one more anecdote. I sent a group of students out to talk to mother-daughter pairs, so an adult daughter and an older mother. And one of the questions they were supposed to ask was, have you made plans to the daughter? Have you made plans if your mother needs as she's aging? And then let's say at some point she might need some support. And then we asked the mother, have you thought about what you'd like in place should you need some support as you age, you know, whatever that might look like. And the mother said to the two students that were interviewing her, they said, well, we were out driving the other day, we're in Portland, and my son-in-law pointed to the Burnside Bridge and said, see that person under the bridge? That won't be you. And the mother then said to the students, so I feel fine. I think that everything will be just fine. And the students looked at me when they were reporting their results and they said, that's not enough, Dr. Manoogian, is it? And I said, no, that's not enough. There needs to be more than that as part of the planning. So that's kind of where I come from in sharing this with everybody. So I'm happy to answer questions later if people have them.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for being here today. And thank you so much for everybody who attended. And like I said before, at the beginning of this session, we will be putting this together and sending the link out to you later, and it will be up on our YouTube channel in the next couple of days. And that is at www.youtube.com/Willamette Valley Hospice. Thank you all so much for being here today. And thank you, Dr. Manoogian, once again. Have a great day. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.